January 4th, 1941. Washington, D.C., USA. The air in the government office was thick with the hum of typewriters, the shuffle of papers, and the clink of old-fashioned telephones. Clara Wesson sat at her desk, her hands moving rhythmically over the keys, transcribing yet another set of notes for her superior. She was a secretary, just another pair of hands in the bustling heart of federal agency that never stopped running. On the surface, her role seemed insignificant, almost laughable in the grand scale of the war raging across the Atlantic. But the work she did, though seemingly mundane, was anything but harmless. Each paper she touched, each report she typed, carried weight. Some she couldn't even understand, encrypted in military jargon and technical language. It wasn't her job to question. It was her job to execute. What she didn't realize, however, was that her very presence in this office had become a linchpin in something far larger than her, far more dangerous. A dangerous game was unfolding within the quiet walls of this government building, a game of espionage, secrecy, and lies. To Clara, this was just another Tuesday. But to those who watched from the shadows, her work had become pivotal in the uncovering of a vast, unseen threat. Clara had joined the office months earlier, barely out of college, with dreams of a simple, stable life. The war seemed far away, something happening on the other side of the world. She never expected her typing skills, honed on old mechanical typewriters, would find their way into the heart of global intelligence. But here she was, doing exactly that, transcribing reports, filing memos, and handling official correspondence without realizing the dangerous nature of what she was handling. It was a dreary morning when Clara first stumbled upon the anomaly. She had been assigned to type up a report from a naval commander stationed overseas, detailing the progress of a covert operation. The paper was hurriedly written, sloppily scrawled with ink in places. As she looked over the sheets, she noticed something peculiar. A line in the middle of the report seemed out of place, an unnecessary jumble of numbers and letters. It was no more than a sentence or two, an accidental string of text that didn't seem to fit anywhere. It was nothing, she thought, just a mistake, a misfire from the commander in his rush. She moved on with her work, focusing on the next document. But something about that string of numbers nagged at her, pulling her attention back like a silent voice calling her name. She hadn't learned to trust her instincts yet, but her gut told her that there was something more. That night, after a long day of typing, Clara stayed late. The office was empty now, save for the flicker of fluorescent lights above her. Her fingers hovered over the typewriter, restless, as she stared at the page with the strange line. The more she examined it, the more she felt a gnawing unease. The text didn't make sense. It wasn't military jargon. It wasn't an error. It was something deliberate. With a nervous breath, Clara carefully pulled out the report and started copying the letters and numbers onto a fresh sheet of paper. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to do this. She wasn't even sure what she intended to do with the result. She just knew that something in her, deep within, couldn't let it go. The string was too precise, too intentional, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Hours later, Clara found herself in the dark of her apartment, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled sheets of paper. Her mind raced as she tried to decipher the code. The numbers seemed to hold some deeper significance, something beyond her comprehension. She wasn't a trained cryptographer, but she had a sharp mind. There was something almost playful about how the code seemed to tease her, how it beckoned her to understand, to see the truth she wasn't meant to see. By the time dawn broke, she had a breakthrough. The string of characters formed a pattern, one that, with careful analysis, began to reveal a message that didn't belong in a routine military report. She had uncovered a secret transmission, an intelligence leak. It wasn't just a slip-up, an accidental mix-up of numbers and letters. It was a deliberate piece of covert communication, meant to be hidden, unnoticed, obscured in the mundane. She sat back, her heart pounding in her chest. Clara had just discovered something that no one was meant to find. A part of her wanted to laugh, to think it was all a game, but the weight of it settled quickly upon her shoulders. This wasn't a game. She was in the middle of something far bigger than herself. In that moment, Clara made a decision. She would tell someone. But who? Who could she trust with this information? She was just a secretary. Her role in the grand machinery of the government was insignificant. No one would believe her. She wasn't supposed to be the one uncovering these things. The next day, Clara found herself at a crossroads. She had no formal training, no authority, no power. Just her instincts and the knowledge that she couldn't ignore the truth she had uncovered. But the cost of speaking out, of revealing the secret she had stumbled upon, was not something she could ignore. The agency she worked for was a juggernaut, filled with men and women of power, of rank, who played their parts in the shadows. What she had discovered could change everything. It could destroy careers. It could end lives. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the weight of that responsibility. But as Clara sat at her desk that morning, the same report sitting in front of her, her gaze fell to the strange line of numbers and letters once more. She could feel the pull, the nagging, persistent voice telling her to act, to uncover the truth. It was a choice now. The question that echoed in her mind wasn't whether she should act, but what would happen if she didn't. The truth, after all, had a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected of places. A quiet secretary, a single line of coded text, the fate of nations hanging by the thinnest of threads. In a world on the brink of war, where every whisper could change the course of history, Clara Wesson had just found herself at the center of a storm she wasn't prepared for. Would she dare to speak? Or would she remain a silent witness to something far larger than herself, forced to watch as the machinery of history turned, indifferent to the truth she had uncovered? The choice was hers, and the world's fate would never be the same. March 17th, 1942. Berlin, Germany. The streets of Berlin were cold, biting. The war had seeped into the bones of the city. Shadows clung to the walls of the buildings, long and twisted, like the uncertainty of a future that no one could predict. In a small, dimly lit office, Captain Heinrich Muller sat at his desk, eyes scanning a pile of documents. He wasn't supposed to be here. Officially, he was a low-ranking officer, too inconspicuous to be involved in any significant operation. But here he was, in the heart of the German military intelligence apparatus, watching over files he shouldn't have access to. Heinrich had always been a man out of place, a reluctant cog in a machine built on secrecy and cruelty. He had never been particularly passionate about the war, nor had he believed in the righteousness of the cause. But duty was duty, and his orders had always been clear. He had served in various capacities, but the mundane life of a desk officer suited him well. He was not an idealist, nor was he a zealot. He was simply someone who did what he was told, never questioning, never doubting. But that was before Clara Wesson's message arrived on his desk. He had never met her, never heard of her. Yet, her handwriting, scrawled hastily on a small scrap of paper, had pierced through the monotony of his day. She had sent a single note, one that seemed nonsensical at first, a message from across the world, from a woman he'd never laid eyes on. At first, Heinrich thought it was a joke, perhaps a prank, or even a deliberate attempt to send him on some wild goose chase. The note was cryptic, full of strange symbols and numbers, none of which made any immediate sense. But something in the way it was written, a subtle sense of urgency, a plea for help, pricked his curiosity. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his time serving the Reich. He had a choice: dismiss it, move on, and forget about it. It was, after all, just a secretary's message. The work he did was far removed from the chaos of frontline combat or high-stakes intelligence operations. But there was a part of him, buried deep within, that couldn't let go. The weeks that followed were filled with careful observation. Every small detail, every conversation. The pattern of Clara's message began to form in Heinrich's mind like a puzzle he couldn't ignore. The more he looked, the more the pieces fell into place. He understood that this wasn't some random outburst of confusion from a secretary. This was a deliberate warning, a warning of something far darker, more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. By the time he reached out to Clara, he knew that she had uncovered something monumental, something that could threaten the very core of the military operation she worked for. But how could he explain it to her? How could he convince her that he wasn't simply another part of the system that had put her at risk? The idea of her trusting him seemed ridiculous. He was just a nameless officer in the sprawling network of Nazi bureaucracy. Despite his doubts, Heinrich made the decision. He had to act. Clara had given him a chance to do something, to be part of something that felt meaningful, something beyond the endless fog of war. He sent a coded message back, just as cryptic as hers, telling her to meet him. He didn't expect much, but when the time came, Clara appeared, as promised. They met in a quiet corner of the city, away from the prying eyes of the Reich. She was cautious, her movements precise, as if she had rehearsed this moment over and over in her mind. They exchanged nothing more than brief, clipped words, but the understanding between them was immediate. Clara had figured it out, and Heinrich had been waiting for someone like her notice. It didn't take long for them to share what they knew. Clara spoke quickly, nervously, her words tumbling out in a rush. She recounted the coded messages, the strange transmission she had uncovered, and the implications of what it meant. She told him about the report that had first raised her suspicions and how she had traced the message back to a point she could not yet identify. Heinrich listened intently, his mind working overtime, connecting the dots in ways that even Clara had not yet considered. The truth was slowly unfolding before them. A secret transmission, hidden within official military reports, had revealed the existence of a covert operation, an operation so sensitive, so dangerous, that it threatened the entire balance of the war. Clara's discovery had been no accident. She had stumbled upon something far greater than she realized. And Heinrich now saw the depth of the problem. But there was one glaring issue. They were both trapped in systems far larger than themselves, bound by the iron will of bureaucratic institutions that cared little for the truth. The message Clara had uncovered had already begun to spread within the military apparatus, and with each passing day, the danger grew. If they didn't act soon, it would be too late. Heinrich knew what had to be done. He couldn't do it alone, and neither could Clara. They had to expose the truth, but to do so would put both their lives at risk. What had started as an innocent act of curiosity on Clara's part had snowballed into a dangerous game of survival. If the Reich discovered what they knew, they would be erased without a second thought. They were small, insignificant figures, nothing more than cogs in a machine far beyond their control. Yet, in that small, dimly lit office in Berlin, as the cold wind howled outside, a new kind of resistance began to take shape. It wasn't grand or overt. It was quiet, like the faintest whisper in the dark. Clara and Heinrich, two people from opposite sides of the world, had become unlikely allies in a battle that would never be recognized by history. They had discovered a truth that could change the course of the war, but no one would know it. As the days passed, the tension between them grew. Every move they made, every piece of evidence they gathered, pushed them closer to a point of no return. They knew that once they took action, there would be no turning back. But the stakes were higher than ever. If they failed, the consequences would be dire. If they succeeded, they would be nothing more than forgotten ghosts, their names erased from history. For now, though, they had a single chance. They couldn't afford to hesitate. The truth was out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. And the clock was ticking. Would they find a way to expose the conspiracy, or would they be swallowed up by the very system they were trying to destroy? The future seemed as uncertain as the war itself. But one thing was certain. Clara and Heinrich would never go back to their quiet, unnoticed lives. Their worlds had collided, and the course of history would never be the same. November 8th, 1944. Paris, France. The city had been through hell and back, its streets still echoing with the tremors of war. The once glistening boulevards were now scarred with rubble, the iconic architecture reduced to mere fragments of its former grandeur. Yet, amidst the destruction, there was an eerie calm in the air. The war was nearing its end. The Allies were making significant strides, and the Nazi regime was beginning to collapse under its own weight. But for Clara Wesson, the war had already finished in ways she could never have imagined. She had been back in Europe for months now, in and out of cities that no longer felt like home. Clara had spent years in the shadows, quietly witnessing the unraveling of the very system that had nearly cost her everything. The documents, the messages, the secrets, everything she had uncovered, everything she had risked, had led to nothing. In a twisted way, the sabotage had been exposed, but the victory had been hollow. Her name was nowhere to be found in the official records, no acknowledgement of her role in preventing a catastrophe. History had passed her by, as it had passed countless others who stood against the tide of institutional power. The truth had been uncovered. The covert operation she had stumbled upon, an intricate web of espionage, sabotage, and high-level treason, had been thwarted. But the system had turned its back on her. Clara's bravery, her intelligence, had been erased from the narrative of the war. The Allies had never known the full extent of what she had done. No medals, no recognition, no gratitude. The pages of history turned, and her contribution was nothing more than a forgotten footnote. She sat in a small cafe near the heart of Paris, looking out at the remnants of the city. The war had stolen so much, and yet there was still so much that remained. People moved in the streets, trying to find some semblance of normalcy, but Clara couldn't help but feel disconnected. She wasn't part of their world anymore. She had seen the machinery of war up close, had glimpsed its darkest underbelly. She had learned the hard truth, that when the dust settled, those who fought the hardest, who made the greatest sacrifices, were often the ones who disappeared. Clara thought of Heinrich, her unlikely partner in this quiet rebellion. They had never seen each other again after that fateful meeting in Berlin. The last time they spoke, they had agreed to go their separate ways. The risks were too high. Even as the war ended, the shadows of their past loomed over them. They had done what needed to be done, but in the end, they were just two small players in a much larger game. Heinrich had been transferred to a different part of the Reich, far from the front lines of the conflict. The last letter he sent her had been short, terse, practical, even. He was safe for now, but Clara could feel the unspoken weight between the lines of his message. Safety was a fleeting thing in a world that had so little left to give. It was ironic, Clara thought, that they had both risked everything to expose a conspiracy that no one seemed to care about. The enemy had been defeated, the operation dismantled, but the truth of their actions remained buried. The system had swallowed their bravery, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. They had won, and yet they had lost. As the months passed, Clara watched as the world moved on. New heroes emerged, celebrated in the newspapers, their faces immortalized in war documentaries, their names etched into the monuments of history. But none of them had stood where she had stood, or had faced what she had faced. Clara had done what no one else could have. She had uncovered a plot that could have turned the tide of the war. And yet, no one would ever know her name. One evening, as the winter winds began to creep through the cracks of the cafe, Clara overheard a conversation at the table next to hers. It was a group of journalists, speaking in hushed tones, discussing the aftermath of the war. They were talking about the unsung heroes, the people who had made a difference without ever being recognized. They spoke with reverence, even awe, of the bravery that had taken place behind closed doors in the shadows. But Clara knew, she knew that no one would ever write about the likes of her. The war was over, but the erasure of those who had fought quietly, those who had done the unglamorous work, was not. History had a way of distilling the complex into the simplistic, turning the mess of human effort into clean, digestible narratives that fit neatly into the pages of textbooks. The world loved its heroes, but it never cared for the quiet, hidden warriors who had no place in the spotlight.